How many years had passed at this point?
Since
From the time that you sent in the first ones to like the second batch?
a year.
A year?
Ish.
Quite a while.
So when I got what I thought were all the rejections, I put all my materials in the closet. And 2 months later, I get a phone call out of the blue from a woman who said she worked for a company I'd never heard of, some company called United Media. And I hadn't sent my samples to anybody with that name, so it was kind of curious when she said, we like your comic. I didn't even know how they'd seen them. And we'd like to offer you a contract to be a syndicated cartoonist. Like one of the biggest goals in cartooning. But I'd never heard of this syndication company. So I said, I'm flattered by your offer, but I've not heard of your company, this United Media company. And it would help me if you have some references. Is there anybody you've worked with, a cartoonist, who's been published in any way? And there was this long pause. And then she said, yeah, we handle Peanuts and Garfield and Nancy and Roboman and Marmaduke. And when she got to the 12th name on the list, this is when I realized that my negotiating position had been compromised because I didn't know anything about this business.
Right.
Turns out this was the parent company of the syndicate I had sent my samples to, so there was a reason they saw it. So I said yes, got a lawyer, got a contract, took about a year of working with them and developing it until they were ready to publish it.
Okay, so they were actually working with you to create what ended up being Dilbert.
Yes, but in this case, creating is more on the editing side. So there were things that they said, well, do more of this and less of this, but they don't get into the weeds of, make this character this way or change this personality or anything like that.
Okay. So a year later, you finally get to the point where they're getting ready to publish this thing. Okay, so this is now 2 years from the moment that you actually sent in your first samples.
Right.
So you send in your strips and they get put in a newspaper?
Yeah, so the way it works is a team of salespeople hired by the syndication company goes out and they try to sell it in person to every newspaper that they can. It's common when there's a new cartoon, if people are not sure about it, but they think, well, it could be something good, but we're not sure about it, they will buy the rights to it and not run it. Just in case it becomes big, they don't want their competition to get it. Because in those days, if one newspaper had it in a city, we didn't sell it to the other one.
Uh-huh.
So on day one, almost nobody ran it. I think it got sold into maybe 25 newspapers, but almost none of them ran it for the same reason. They were just protecting the rights. Eventually, a few started running it, but it was still pretty much a failure. Not enough people bought it to make it successful, not even close. And there were a number of lucky events and some events that were, I guess, good work that caused things to change for me.
So your first royalty check was $368?
That sounds about right. It was pretty small, yes.
Okay, and that was before the Boston Globe and everything?
That was probably before the Boston Globe, yes.
Okay, so from the time that it started to get picked up, how much time passed?
Well, it was probably a period of 5 years before it became something that anybody had heard of.
Really? So for 5 years, this company stuck with you, United, stuck with you and kept pushing this product even though people weren't really biting?
Well, stuck with me would be overstating it. So the way they do it is they have a new product, they try to sell it for a year or so, and then it either takes off on its own or they put their attention on the next new product, and they let you either sink or swim on your own. So I was about to sink because I no longer had that support, like most of the comics that don't work. It's very rare that any of these launches actually work. 1 in 5, 1 in 10, that's the best you could hope. But I wasn't done myself. And so one of the things that I had as an advantage was I had email before the public had email. And I put my email address because of my day job. I was still working my day job at Pacific Bell. So I put my email address in the margins of the strip, which was revolutionary at the time. Sounds funny now, but nobody had an email then. But the people who did have email, I mean, there were some, all wrote to me. And they all said the same thing, and it's something I had not heard until that point. They said, we like Dilbert a little bit when he's at home doing generic things, which is what he mostly did. But every once in a while, when he's at work, which was not really where he was most of the time, it wasn't a workplace comic, they said, we love it when he's at work. We cut them out, we send them around. And they all said the same thing. So that's when I changed the comic to a workplace comic. So it was a big change. I got rid of all my artistic integrity. I didn't have much to begin with. And just said, well, if that's what the customers want, I'm not going to be an artist about it. I'm going to be a manufacturer, I guess. I'm going to give them what they're asking for. Mm-hmm. So that was a big step. So as soon as I made it a workplace comic, people had a reason to forward it around. It started growing on its own. And then the next big thing was the internet. So when websites became a thing, I also was early on that because of my day job again. We were doing early things with the website before people had even heard of something called the internet. Literally, people hadn't heard the word at this time. Mm-hmm. My syndicate and I decided to put it on the internet because we had nothing to lose. It was still a failing comic, so we could do things that other people couldn't do. And it was a big risk to put it on the internet because you were giving it away for free.
Right.
At the same time, other people were paying for it. And we didn't know how they would take that. Turns out they were okay with it. And having it on the internet allowed our salespeople to go in and say, look, here's a whole pile of email from people who are in your district who say they want this because they've already seen it on the internet. Mm. And then it sold everywhere.
So this whole 5 years, you still had your day job. You were still working at Pacific Bell and drawing comics on the side because the comics weren't paying anything.
Yeah, I was getting up at 4 a.m., drawing for a few hours, going to work, and then coming home and drawing and finishing the drawing for the rest of the night.
And you couldn't just quit your day job because the comics weren't paying anything?
For the first several years, I couldn't. For the last few years of my day job, I was making enough money that I could have quit, but it became so easy to go to my day job because I didn't worry about anything, because I could quit. And I was already getting famous, so I was famous at work as well. And my coworkers actually made a deal with me that they would do my work for me, at least in the final year or two, I think. They would actually do my work for me. I could come in whenever I wanted. And the only thing that they asked me is if they had a customer who they wanted to show our products to, that I would come in that day. Because the customers were treating me like a celebrity already. So it was just a good way to sell their products.
So 6 years later, your comic strip is being picked up in major markets all across the country. It's time for you to quit your day job.
Well, it turns out I got fired.
You got fired?
Yeah. Sort of half fired, half quit. I'd made a deal with my boss that if they ever needed the budget for someone who did real work, they just had to ask me and I would leave. Because he was aware of the deal my coworkers had made with me that they were doing my work.
Okay.
And one day he called me in and said, I need the budget for something else. And I said, thanks. And it was time.
Right.
The timing was okay, so I was good with it.
Well, I think I remember reading that the one thing he asked you was not to put him in the comic strip.
Yeah, that didn't work for him.
Yeah, which you did.
Yeah, he was in the comic strip almost immediately.
Almost immediately after that.
Yeah, I can't remember if I did it while I was still working for him. It was around that time.
Well, I think what was interesting about Dilbert is that before Dilbert came around, you had Peanuts, you had these various comic strips, but Silicon Valley was starting to form. And the computer revolution was starting to happen, and engineering became a more serious thing. Like, I went to computer science at UC Berkeley, so it was like suddenly this world that I could relate to, there's now a comic strip that actually talks about it. My first job out of college was at a startup, and I was in a cubicle, and I was writing code all day and so forth. So it was like the timing of it was interesting because there was nothing like it that was feeding all these people that could relate.
Yeah, one of the things I learned about humor writing, and this is the most non-obvious humor writing advice you'll ever get, and I got this from Bill Keane, who did Family Circus. And the idea is that if you write for yourself, meaning things that you think are going to be funny, then you've only written for yourself, and nobody else wants to look at it. So you have to write about other people's lives, and they will find that hilarious, even if it isn't. So you could leave out a lot of technique if somebody says, oh, that's me. they will think that's hilarious because you talked about them. So talking about other people is actually the skill of humor, and it's the most underrated part of it.
So in all these years, have you ever just said, I don't feel like working this week, I'm going to miss a couple days, I'm going to go on vacation, I'm not going to do it? I mean, because it's a very interesting type of job where you have to do it yourself and you're required to do it 365 days a year, right?
Yeah, one of the things I had working for me for decades is this fear that if I stopped doing it for a few days, I wouldn't be able to do it. You know, I felt like I was in a zone, a rhythm. And I tested that a few times by, you know, every once in a while you got to travel, you got to take a few days off. And it is way harder as soon as you come back to get back to find the zone again. So it's a real thing, and I was petrified of it. So I did work every day if I could. Only in the last year have I even experimented with trying to move my work times around and, you know, take some days off. I'm experimenting with that now, actually.
Was there ever a point where you said, maybe I should bring in an assistant, a partner, you know, someone that I could train that could possibly help me out and take over some of this stuff?
So just this year I had some pretty bad hand problems. My hand was, it's a longer story, but I was having some spasms from overuse. And so for a week I had guest artists, you know, just different artists who were actual artists, but they would do a day or a week of it. And I waited to see if my hand would get better, but it wasn't getting better as quickly as possible. So right now I am using an art assistant.
What I noticed about Dilbert is that it came out in the comic strips, but very quickly after it became popular, you start seeing the books. You start seeing merchandise and so forth. Now, was that your idea, or is that something United came up with, or?
Well, the books, there are lots of different types of books. So some of them are just reprints of the comic. Yeah. But the ones that made the biggest difference are the ones that I wrote new material for.
Yeah, and I bought some of those.
The Dilbert Principle, for example.
Yeah, I think that's the one, that's the first one?
Yeah, that was the first big one.
I think that's the one that I bought, yeah.
And that came about because the Wall Street Journal liked my comic and said, hey, could you write a guest article about business? And I wrote an article that my publisher looked at and said, hey, this could be a book. So at one point, I was working my day job, writing a book, and doing the comic at the same time. Those were very busy times. And when the Dilbert Principle became #1 bestseller.
So New York Times bestseller.
New York Times bestseller,
nonfiction. Wow. How did it feel? So before we kind of keep going with this, how did it feel not only to have, you know, a very popular comic strip in all these countries, but now you have a New York Times best-selling novel?
Well, let me tell you. Before it was #1, it was in the top 10, and it climbed up to #2. And just sat there week after week. And Dennis Rodman had a book that was #1.
I read it.
And week after week, it sat there. And I would tell myself, I have the #2 book on the New York Times list. I'm pretty happy about that. And I thought I was happy until it hit #1. And I cried.
You actually cried?
I cried. My life changed. All right, this is where I do most of my drawing. This is a Wacom Cintiq. That's the name of the screen. It works with a regular computer, but I can just draw on the screen much the way I would draw on paper. So here's one that I've already done. And here's one that's before the color is added. And I'll just give you an idea of what the drawing process looks like. First step is usually a rough. So I create a new layer. This would make sense to people who use Photoshop. I'm just using regular Photoshop software. And if I were to try to add a character here, I would pick my pen size and my color, and I might be drawing, let's say, Dilbert looking at him from behind. First draft would be very rough, just to kind of get the general idea. Might look something like this. Maybe he's got his arm like that. All right, and then I look at it, and of course, I'm thinking the same thing you're doing, which is, that looks terrible, but it doesn't matter. because in the second phase, what I do is I lighten that layer. It's called a layer. And then when I do the finish art, I'll come in tighter. And if this were the real thing, I would make sure that my lines were a little better and a little truer to the character. I'll just do this quickly so you can get the idea. All right, this would be a lot better if I were taking my time. And we'll just give them a nose and then I'll show you the next step. So, and then I can remove the rough draft layer. If there's something I don't like, let's say I've got a line that doesn't belong, I can just make it go away. Let's say I don't want Dilbert here. Let's say I want him smaller, and over there, I can just move him around. And if I want him facing the other direction, I can just turn him that way. So we've got the kind of flexibility you could never have on paper, obviously. And then, when you reach the point where you want to add the color, this used to be a whole long, terrible process. But now, not so much. I'll show you. Swatches. Now all I have to do is choose my color, and oh, this one would have to be changed to a different mode. It's a little more like computer programming than it is like drawing these days, because there's so much processing that goes on. All right, so now that I got it set up, if I want to add color, it's just one tap. Like that. And let's do his shirt. That process would have taken a long time in the old days. So when I'm done, I just send these files off to my cartoon syndication company, and they send it out to the rest